Cop shot. Elderly black man to death. Unaware his son is most dangerous attorney general. Elias Carter had lived in the same neighborhood for nearly 50 years, watching the world change around him in ways that never seemed to favor those like him. The streets bore the marks of time: cracked sidewalks, faded murals from long-forgotten community efforts, and storefronts that had been abandoned, their windows covered with metal shutters that rattled in the wind. Yet, despite the decay, there was a sense of familiarity, a rhythm to life that he had long accepted. Each morning he rose before the sun, the aches in his joints a reminder of age, but not a deterrent. He would shuffle into the kitchen, where the scent of old wood and ground coffee lingered in the air, a quiet remnant of his late wife's morning rituals. The house itself was a testament to his life, its walls lined with books, faded photographs of better days, and framed newspaper clippings that documented his son's meteoric rise. Though the space was small, it was enough. It was home. The streets outside were rougher than they had been in his younger years, but Elias walked them anyway. He nodded to the few shopkeepers who still opened their businesses every morning, exchanged greetings with neighbors who had also refused to leave, and stopped by the small park where elders gathered on sunlit days. There, he would sit on the worn wooden bench, watching the city stir to life. The world moved faster than it once had, but Elias remained steady, anchored in a past that still held meaning. The respect he commanded was not because of fear or wealth, but because he had been a teacher, a mentor, a man who had seen generations grow under his guidance. Some of his former students now had families of their own, others had drifted away, but those who remained never failed to acknowledge him. It was in these moments, amidst the quiet acknowledgments and unspoken gratitude, that he felt most at peace. But there were cracks in that peace, subtle yet persistent. The city had never been kind to men like him, and though he had outlived many who had doubted him, he could not ignore the weight of the world pressing down on his community. The crime, the poverty, the endless cycle of struggle, it had worn people down. The police patrolled more frequently, but their presence did little to reassure those who had long been conditioned to fear them. Elias, however, had no illusions. He had seen enough to know that justice was often reserved for those with power, and mercy was a luxury rarely extended to those without it. He had spent decades teaching students to believe in something better, yet even he had begun to wonder if that belief had been misplaced. Malcolm Carter, his son, had been shaped by these same streets, but had chosen a different path. While Elias had fought his battles within the walls of a classroom, Malcolm had waged war in the courtroom. He had never been one for sentimentality, had never lingered in nostalgia. Where Elias had found solace in patience and wisdom, Malcolm had embraced strategy and precision. The world did not reward good men, only strong ones. From the moment he had understood the weight of his father's sacrifices, he had vowed to become a man that no one could overlook, no one could dismiss. And he had done just that. Malcolm had carved a name for himself in a world that had been designed to keep men like him from rising. He had studied relentlessly, honed his instincts, and built a reputation as an attorney who did not lose. Every case was a battle, every verdict a statement. He had taken on corrupt officials, dismantled criminal enterprises, and stood before judges who had never expected to see a man like him command a courtroom with such authority. But it had come at a cost. The higher he climbed, the further he drifted from the life he had once known. His visits home became infrequent, his conversations with Elias brief. He told himself it was necessary, that keeping his father at a distance was the only way to protect him. Power came with enemies, and Malcolm had many. If they ever found a way to use Elias against him, he knew they would not hesitate. Yet, despite all his victories, there were battles he could not win. He could not turn back time, could not bridge the growing silence between himself and the man who had raised him. He had built his life on control, on ensuring that every move was calculated, every action intentional. But control did not mend old wounds, nor did it soften the sting of knowing that he had missed countless opportunities to simply sit with his father, to listen to stories that would one day be lost. He had convinced himself that there would always be time, that duty came first. But duty had a way of consuming everything. On the other side of the city, another man was navigating a world of his own making. Thomas Raleigh had wanted to be a police officer for as long as he could remember. There was something about the authority, the sense of power that came with the uniform, that had always appealed to him. He had grown up idolizing the idea of law and order, believing in the narratives he had been fed about what it meant to be a protector. But the academy had only prepared him for the theory of the job, not the reality. The reality was that respect was earned through dominance, that hesitation was weakness, and that those who hesitated did not last long. Sergeant Cole had been quick to teach him these lessons. The older officer had been on the force for over 20 years, a man hardened by experience and emboldened by a system that rarely held him accountable. He saw Raleigh as a blank slate, someone to mold, someone to shape into the kind of officer who understood the unspoken rules of the streets. The first time Raleigh had questioned a rough takedown, Cole had given him a look that made it clear. This was not the academy. This was real life, and in real life, hesitation got you killed. At first, Raleigh had resisted the more brutal aspects of the job, but the pressure to prove himself was relentless. He wanted the respect of his peers, wanted to be seen as someone who could handle the weight of the badge. And so, slowly, he adjusted. Small infractions became easier to justify. Minor uses of force were explained away. He told himself that it was necessary, that he was only doing what needed to be done. The first time he drew his weapon in a tense situation, his hands trembled. The second time, they were steady. The city had been tense lately, protests simmering beneath the surface, frustrations mounting. There were whispers of new policies, of reforms being pushed by those in power. Malcolm Carter's name came up often, spoken with a mixture of admiration and resentment. Some in the department saw him as a threat, an obstacle standing in the way things had always been done. Others viewed him as an inevitable force, someone who would change the landscape whether they wanted him to or not. Raleigh didn't know what to think of him, only that men like Sergeant Cole spoke of him with disdain. As the days passed, the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to tip the balance. And, unseen by those caught in their daily routines, the paths of three men, Elias Carter, Malcolm Carter, and Thomas Raleigh, moved ever closer to collision. The weight of their choices, their histories, and their beliefs would soon come crashing together in a way that none of them could anticipate. The storm that had been building was about to break, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. Elias Carter had always believed that a home was more than just walls and a roof. It was memory, history, and the quiet hum of a life well lived. His neighborhood had changed, faces he once knew replaced by unfamiliar ones, but he refused to leave. The house had been his wife's sanctuary, the place where Malcolm had grown from a wide-eyed boy into a determined young man. Every creak in the floor, every dent in the wooden furniture, was a reminder of a life shared, of moments that no longer existed anywhere but in his heart. He had received offers over the years, people eager to buy the property, developers hungry for land, but he had dismissed them without hesitation. There was nowhere else he could be. This house, this street, was the last place that still held the echoes of the life he had built. That evening, the air was thick with the quiet weight of approaching night, the streetlights flickering as if unsure whether they wished to stay awake. Elias sat in his armchair, flipping through an old photo album, his tired eyes tracing the contours of faces that time had stolen from him. The doorbell rang, breaking the stillness. He exhaled, moving carefully, mindful of the way his knees protested with each step. A package. He had nearly forgotten. He had ordered a book, a collection of speeches from civil rights leaders, words that had once inspired him in his younger days. With slow, deliberate movements, he stepped onto the porch, his breath catching slightly at the chill in the air. At the same time, Officer Thomas Raleigh patrolled the area, his fingers gripping the steering wheel with nervous tension. The radio crackled, a dispatch coming through. A vague report. Someone had called in about a suspicious figure. No description, no real details, just enough to justify a presence. His mind raced. He had been waiting for a moment like this, an opportunity to prove himself. The past few weeks had been frustrating. His efforts dismissed, his authority questioned. He had seen the way the older officers smirked at him, their silent judgments hanging over him like a shadow. Tonight, he would change that. As he drove down the dimly lit street, He spotted movement on a porch. A lone figure, elderly, slow-moving. But Raleigh didn't process those details. His training had ingrained a singular instinct: control the situation before it controls you. The narrative in his head overrode the reality before him. His heart pounded, adrenaline surging. He stepped out of the car, hand hovering over his holster. Elias barely had time to register the presence before a sharp voice cut through the air, ordering him to stop. He turned, squinting against the glare of the patrol car's headlights, confusion settling in. He had done nothing wrong. He raised a hand slightly, the package still in his grip, trying to speak, trying to explain. His voice was calm, measured, but it did not matter. Raleigh saw hesitation as defiance. He barked another command, his grip tightening on the weapon he hadn't yet drawn, but was seconds away from pulling. Elias moved slowly, not by choice but by the inevitability of age. Arthritis made even the simplest actions a struggle. He extended his hand, meaning to show the officer he was unarmed, that he was just an old man standing on his own porch. But Raleigh didn't see an elderly man. He saw a figure in the dark, a shape moving too slowly for his liking, an unknown variable that he needed to control. The gun was drawn before he fully understood why he had reached for it. The weight in his palm felt reassuring, the sense of authority it granted him intoxicating in a way he had never admitted to himself. Elias took another step forward, lips parting to say something, anything to defuse the situation. But Raleigh's mind had already reached its conclusion. A threat, a hesitation, a reaction. The shot rang out, splitting the night in two. For a moment, everything stilled. The world itself seemed to hold its breath. The old man staggered, his body swaying as if caught in an invisible current. The package slipped from his fingers, landing beside him as he collapsed onto the porch. His hand twitched slightly, reaching, not for a weapon, not in aggression, but in the desperate, instinctual grasp of someone who did not yet believe this was how his story would end. His eyes, wide with shock, searched the empty night for something that was no longer there. And then, silence. Raleigh stood frozen, his own breath a deafening roar in his ears. His mind struggled to process what had just happened. His training had not prepared him for the sickening weight settling in his stomach, the creeping realization that he had made a mistake, an irreversible one. Back at the station, the body cam footage played on a loop. Officers gathered around the screen, their faces unreadable. Sergeant Cole leaned back in his chair, his expression calm, calculating. He knew what they were looking at, what the world would see if they let this footage make its way beyond these walls. A problem, a potential stain on the department. He exhaled slowly, then turned to Raleigh. Mistakes happen. Reports can be adjusted, narratives can be controlled. A decision was made before Raleigh had even understood the full weight of it. The official statement crafted itself. Elias Carter had been behaving erratically. The officer had feared for his safety. The details blurred, the story shaped into something digestible, something that fit the pattern of countless incidents before this one. The media was fed the usual phrases: an unfortunate event, an ongoing investigation, an officer placed on administrative leave. The city stirred, outrage bubbling beneath the surface, but the machine remained intact. Hundreds of miles away, Malcolm Carter's phone rang. He answered, his voice steady, professional, the tone of a man who had long learned to expect bad news. But nothing prepared him for the words that followed. His father. Shot. Police. A clinical explanation, cold and detached, as if the man who had raised him, the man whose sacrifices had shaped his entire existence, had been reduced to nothing more than a casualty and someone else's mistake. His fingers tightened around the phone, his body rigid with a stillness more dangerous than fury. Years of distance, of carefully constructed barriers, meant nothing now. He had built his life around the idea that he could change the system from within, that justice was something that could be shaped, molded, argued for in courtrooms filled with men who had never known what it was to lose. But justice had not saved his father. Grief settled in his chest, an unfamiliar, suffocating weight. Then came the anger, not the controlled, strategic anger he wielded in courtrooms, but something deeper, something more primal. The system had taken from him, had stolen what little remained of the life he had tried to protect. He had spent years learning its rules, mastering its language, believing that power could bend it in the right direction. But power was not enough. Malcolm Carter did not grieve passively. The city did not yet know what was coming, did not yet understand that it had taken something from a man who did not forgive, who did not forget. The streets would soon echo with the weight of consequences, and the system that had thrived in the shadows of injustice would learn that some men, once provoked, did not simply fade into silence. The world expected another grieving son swallowed by the slow, grinding gears of a system designed to exhaust and pacify. The headlines carried the same familiar words: tragedy, investigation, administrative leave, each phrase carefully chosen to convey the appearance of action without substance. But Malcolm Carter was no ordinary son. He had spent years unraveling the system's darkest corners, exposing corruption, and forcing those in power to answer for their sins. And now, all of that experience, every battle he had fought, every case he had won, narrowed to a singular point. The murder of his father would not fade into the endless cycle of justice delayed, justice denied. The system had taken from him, and now he would take from it. Malcolm moved with lethal precision. Before the police department could manufacture a story, before the footage could be quietly edited, he issued formal demands for the full, unaltered body cam recording. There would be no time for excuses, no room for narratives to shift. The governor and the mayor received direct calls, not as authorities, but as men who understood what it meant to be backed into a corner. The weight of Malcolm's reputation loomed over them. If they hesitated, he would make their silence complicit. He did not ask. He informed them of their next steps. They would comply, or they would fall. Within hours, the city's temperature rose. Information selectively leaked found its way into the hands of the right journalists, those with no patience for soft angles or empty official statements. The story exploded across networks. An unarmed elderly man shot on his own porch, a respected teacher, a pillar of his community, a father gunned down by an officer too quick to pull the trigger. The outrage was immediate and unrelenting. Protests erupted in the streets, fueled by a public already teetering on the edge. The calls for action grew louder, drowning out the hollow promises of a thorough investigation. But Malcolm knew public outcry alone would never be enough. He needed more than anger. He needed an unshakable case. As the city burned with fury, Officer Raleigh unraveled. The department, once his shield, now regarded him as an inconvenient liability. At first, they reassured him. They had handled worse. The right words, the right legal maneuvers, and the storm would pass. But as Malcolm tightened his grip, the cracks widened. The narrative was slipping, the usual excuses proving insufficient. Raleigh began to see the truth. He was expendable. If it meant preserving the department's image, they would cast him aside without hesitation. And Malcolm ensured that realization settled deep in his bones. Every step was methodical. Malcolm's team unearthed buried police reports, past complaints that had vanished under layers of bureaucracy. There was a pattern, a history of unchecked aggression, of complaints dismissed with a signature and a quiet warning to be more careful next time. And at the center of it all, Sergeant Cole. His fingerprints were everywhere, mentoring young officers in the art of justifiable force, instructing them in the precise language that could twist a shooting from a crime into a regrettable necessity. Cole had spent decades building walls around himself, but Malcolm had spent his career dismantling men just like him. The pressure mounted. Raleigh's mind spiraled as he saw the options before him shrinking. He had been assured protection, but he was beginning to understand that no lifeline was coming. He was alone, and as Malcolm continued to close in, Raleigh's choices reduced to one: confession or complete ruin. It was not mercy that forced his hand, nor was it guilt. It was fear. The system that had molded him, that had taught him to see every black man as a threat, had also conditioned him to recognize when power had shifted. And Malcolm Carter was power incarnate. Under the weight of relentless questioning, damning evidence, and the growing certainty that he had no allies left, Raleigh broke. His confession was a quiet, fractured thing, but its impact was seismic. Elias Carter had posed no threat. He had been an old man retrieving a package, nothing more. Raleigh admitted to the ingrained bias, the way he had been trained to escalate, to control, to eliminate risk before it existed. And worst of all, he confirmed what Malcolm had already uncovered. The department had instructed him on what to say, how to frame the story before the media could ask the first question. The trial commenced, but Malcolm's vision extended far beyond a single conviction. He did not enter that courtroom merely to put Raleigh behind bars. That was too small a prize. His father had been a victim, but the crime did not begin and end with one officer's mistake. The corruption ran deeper, and Malcolm intended to expose every layer. As the trial progressed, he transformed the courtroom into a stage, not for vengeance, but for reckoning. He painted the picture with devastating clarity. The unchecked brutality, the unspoken policies, the institutional rot that allowed men like Raleigh to believe they were above consequence. He dissected the very foundation of the system, forcing those in power to confront the reality they had spent decades avoiding. And the world listened. The weight of his words, the undeniable force of his evidence, rippled beyond the walls of the courthouse. The old strategies, delay, distract, deflect, crumbled beneath the sheer magnitude of the case Malcolm had built. The system, for once, could not look away. The people would not let it. And as the gavel echoed through the courtroom, the verdict looming on the horizon, Malcolm Carter stood unwavering, knowing that this fight was only the beginning. The case explodes onto the national stage, igniting debates in newsrooms and protests in the streets. The police department reels under the scrutiny, its carefully constructed walls of secrecy crumbling. Officers, once assured of protection, scramble to cut deals. Sergeant Cole, the man who had shaped generations of officers in his brutal image, is arrested. His silence is no longer an option, and as others begin to flip, the scope of corruption widens. The city waits, holding its breath for the verdict that could shatter or reinforce the status quo. The jury deliberates, the weight of history pressing down on them. The tension is unbearable. Then the verdict is read, guilty, a conviction that defies precedent. For the first time in decades, the system bends toward justice. A police officer, found guilty for the murder of an innocent black man. The world watches, stunned. Yet, for Malcolm Carter, this is not a victory. It is a beginning. At the cemetery, the wind moves through the trees as Malcolm stands before his father's grave. He does not weep. There is no solace in a verdict. He speaks no words, but the promise is there, unshaken. Elias Carter's death will not fade into another statistic, another fleeting headline. He will ensure it. He turns away, stepping forward, not as a grieving son, but as a warrior preparing for the next fight. The system took everything from him. Now, he will take everything from it.